Hi, I'm Kathryn. I'm not really a farmer, but it's the fall of 2020. There's a pandemic on. It's a good time to be in the middle of nowhere with some birds and your friends and a few things to do. I am a physicist, or I guess technically, or at least I was one. I'm also a mom, and right now that means I'm spending a lot of time around very silly children playing with animals, and very silly animals playing with children, and very silly vegetables just being silly vegetables. So you know, what's up? Chicken butt. I've been learning a lot about chickens lately. They're very curious birds. They're interested in understanding the world around them. They do this primarily through pecking. Of course, humans are pretty curious too, and physics is one of the ways that we understand the world. And the point of this set of videos is to share some perspectives from physics on the nature and structure of matter in particular. Matter, as in the stuff that makes up stuff, meaning objects and materials. Now, I've spent a lot of time around folks who work in the arts, and in that context, object and material are complex and expansive concepts. For example, we can talk about ideas as objects, or about code, or sound, or history as material. In an arts context, even if we're talking about things that physicists would think of as matter, I've learned that it's hard to think about any object as a simple, individuated thing. For example, consider this rock. It was taken from a nearby river by my child, who painted it with glitter glue and adorned it with a sequin. Should we consider this as a single object, or is it a combination of several? Does its thingness embody its history? And if so, does that include the history of the rock, the millennia over which it was worn down by the river? Does it include the history of the materials that make up the rock, all the way back to the Big Bang? Does it include the economic and cultural history of glitter and sequins? Does the thingness of the rock embody matters of ethics? Are there acts of appropriation or environmental injustice embodied in the rock? Does the context matter, given that this was made by a child, meant not for an art gallery but for a windowsill? What about the colonial context in which my child has access to this river and these materials to express herself? All of these questions might matter in considering the matter of the rock from different perspectives. You might think that things would be simpler from the point of view of physics. In a way, that's true. If I put on my physicist hat and I pick up the rock, I'm interested in the kinds of things that I can measure about the rock, its physical properties, like its weight, its size, the materials that it's made of, their properties, things like their color. But one point of this set of videos is to underscore the subtle and complex things that physics actually says about the nature and structure of matter, if you look deeply enough. For example, we can clearly see in the picture on the right that light reflects off the sequin on the rock, resulting in a purple spot in the room. When we think about the rock as a physical object, should we include the effect it has on the environment as part of the rock, or something separate? Where do we draw that line? A physical analysis of the rock as a thing is also fraught with many questions. But let me back up. In physics, matter is stuff that has mass. I'll say more about mass in a moment, but I want to emphasize that matter doesn't need to be in the form of an object. It doesn't need to be visible. Air is the most obvious example. We can't see the air, but we can feel its material nature. It moves things. It does stuff. Changes things. The material nature of the air is also apparent when plants transform the matter of the air into a visible form. A zucchini plant can harvest carbon from the air to build a tiny little vegetable like this one into a giant monster like this one. Visible, tactile, completely absurd. Matter, as I mentioned, is defined by the fact that it has mass. If something has mass, it counts as matter. If it doesn't have mass, it isn't matter. The property of mass is not related to the property of size, even though in everyday language we might use the word that way. Sometimes we think a massive object is a really large one. Mass in physics doesn't relate to size, and that's illustrated by this comparison of a balloon and a really weird-looking tomato. These two objects are similar in size, but they have quite different masses. I can tell this because they have different weights. The balloon weighs 3 grams. The tomato weighs 467. However, mass and weight are not exactly the same thing. Weight relates to the way that the Earth's gravity pulls on the mass of an object. If I took the balloon and the tomato into deep space, they would be weightless, and a scale would not work to measure their differences in mass. However, mass is still measurable and still important out in deep space. I could tell there was a difference between the balloon and the tomato, not by weighing them, but by poking them. Out in space, just like here on Earth, more massive objects are harder to move. To recap then, matter is anything that has mass, and mass is the property that determines how hard something is to move. And light is the main thing in physics that shows why these distinctions are interesting and important. Light doesn't have mass at all. As a result, it's not at all hard to make light move. In fact, it's impossible to make it slow down. Okay, the other thing I want to do in this video is talk about the structures of matter, and particularly the structures of matter as we zoom in and consider smaller and smaller size scales. This weed from my garden is an example of a macroscopic object that we might measure in inches or centimeters. On this scale, it has structures like a stem and leaves and veins. But imagine what you would see if you zoomed in on this plant. Zoomed in even more, and more and more and more, and kept going to the limits of technology and beyond. What kinds of structures might you find? Well, even before zooming in very far, we discover these interesting little hairs. They're not hairs at all. Actually, they function more like hypodermic needles. This is a stinging nettle plant, and each of these needles is filled with an irritating chemical that the plant can inject into the skin of any animal that walks by. I'm a little obsessed with these plants. I think they're amazing. And I was surprised to discover that I could take a reasonable cell phone video showing what it looks like when you zoom in and see one of these needles up close. There it is in the upper left. Pretty ouchy, right? Of course, I can't zoom in and show you the chemicals inside that needle, or the atoms that make up those chemicals, or the particles that make up those atoms. And that's not just because I don't have the right technology. It's also because the structures of matter on extremely small scales can't really be imaged or even visualized in the same way as macroscopic structure. And that's one of the themes I really want to develop in the rest of this set of videos. As a quick vocabulary overview, when I say the macroscopic scale, I mean anything on the human scale or larger. Typically, these are objects or organisms or materials that we can see or feel. If the object in question is a living organism, there's a layer of microscopic structure, living cells and their subcomponents, that's associated with biological activity. And I'm not illustrating that with a picture because I want you to be critical about what it means to make a picture of something that isn't intrinsically visible to the human eye. On an even smaller scale, we get to the level of chemical structures, otherwise known as molecules. This is where we go quantum. These molecules are made up of atoms, which is another level of structure. And each atom is built from particles at the level of so-called subatomic structures. And that's as far as it goes, as far as contemporary physics is concerned. And I still haven't put pictures in any of these boxes, because the smaller we go, the harder it is to understand how we could make an image of or even visualize any of these entities. Maybe for the biggest biological structures, there might be a fairly natural correspondence between the drawing we would draw and the concept and a thing you could see, like something you could see in a microscope. But those correspondences break down when we get to the level of chemistry or atomic physics or particle physics. This is a diagram that might be used to represent the molecular structure of formic acid, which is one of the chemicals in a stinging nettle needle. The diagram represents some things that are scientifically established about formic acid molecules. The molecule is made from 5 atoms, 1 carbon atom, 2 hydrogen atoms, and 2 oxygen atoms. They have a particular spatial arrangement. But those atoms are not like little balls, and they're not rigidly attached like this. There really isn't any analogy between the atoms in a molecule and a structure you could build macroscopically. The basic nature of an atom is completely different from the nature of a tomato or a rock. And even insofar as it's difficult, as we discussed earlier, to define what we mean by an object when we're talking about a rock, it's even harder to define what we mean by an object when we're talking about a molecule. Molecules, and the atoms that make them up, aren't visible. They aren't things we can touch. They make up the things that are visible and that we can touch. But the more that we zoom in to understand the structure of matter, the more we realize that there are very limited analogies we can make between the structure of matter on a fundamental scale and anything macroscopic that we could interact with, that we could see or smell or feel or peck. And Lucille, you're falling asleep. So let me review the main points here. So everything around us, including you, Lucille, is made of matter. The defining property of matter is that it has mass. Mass is the property of matter that determines how hard it is to move. Like when you have your little chicken fights with your friends, the more massive chickens are the least affected by your chest bumps. Yeah. Matter on a macroscopic scale is not always visible, but often it is. But on a microscopic scale, zooming in to the level of biological structure, chemical structure, atomic structure, and subatomic structure, the constituents of matter are not only invisible, but often non-visualizable. And if we can't make sense of these things through visualization, I don't really think that your beak is going to help, but you can try. Let me know how it goes.